Hey, my name's Bruce Snell. I'm with BSG International, and today we're going to be going over Class 9, defining the organizational systems. Where we're at now in the Applied Business Science Certificate Program, we've worked through Part 1, which is talking about the 4 barriers to quality, to get an understanding and an awareness of how those 4 barriers are interacting daily with us in business. And then Part 2, what we just completed, was a structured base, building and looking at the infrastructure in regards to defining the organizational structure and the team structure and the work center concepts, as well as some foundation skills of interpersonal and awareness. Part 3 we're going to get started on is a systems base, starting to formalize, and today's class is really starting to define the organizational systems. So this is kind of where we're at now in the program. If you will open up your handout and let's look at the executive summary, and we're going to start looking at defining these organizational systems and the stuff behind that. Okay. As a system is the way we do things internally in the organization. It is usually made up of process, steps, and procedures. And when we're talking about that, the systems are really what we're doing internally within the organization. And we want to look at every system has processes. Processes linked together create the system. And for every process, there is a steps and procedures. And this is where we're talking about, as we really discovered, the base work center is the key to all of this. A good system comes not from inspection, but from the improvement of the process, steps, and procedure that make up the systems. Now, what we're saying here is that most of us, the way that we go in and try to improve a system is that we kind of stick in a quality inspector, final inspector, or whatever. What we're saying is that by putting in an inspector, that is not improving the system. So what we're saying here is that really what we got to do is kind of build good quality into that system. So the only way that we're going to improve the process is define the systems. And by defining the systems, we improve the process. So that's kind of what we're looking at, defining and looking at these organizational systems. Let's look at page 2. And let's look at here, we're saying, simply speaking, what is the workplace? Now this is kind of an interesting thing. We've heard how complex business is and how complex the organization is. We've covered this before, but again, let's look at as we're looking at these systems to look at what the workplace looks like. Really, all there is in a workplace is people, personalities, process, procedures, systems, and the managing, planning, scheduling, and the monitoring of all of those things. And that's what we're looking at as far as how to continuously improve business and what we're doing. So this is really all that we're dealing with internally within the workplace. Now let's look at, on page 3, it says define the process. Creating a flow chart should be your next step. And what we're saying here is that when we're looking at defining the process, we've all heard of process mapping, flow charting, and all that. And so we ended up just kind of calling it a process, step, and procedure as we define those processes linked together to define that system. So if you look at really all we're doing in defining the process, step, and procedure of your base work center or of that system is kind of like flow charting or process mapping, just kind of laying it out. But we're coming back in and looking at those steps and then defining the procedures. And again, what we're saying, all of this has to be done by base work centers. This again is why those base skills have to be in place throughout the organization for us to focus in on this. Let's look at defining the procedures. It's very important to get the employees involved in defining the procedures. Now, why is it important to get the employees defining the procedures? Because they're the ones that know how to do the job. Okay, now how do you do that? Well, we have to deliver the base skills, and we have to do that by base work center and by process. So if you look at it, as we're developing these systems, these organizational systems, we need to have these base skills to where we can define the process, steps, and procedures and base work centers. So really, in effect, we're breaking up the organization by these base work centers. Okay, as we start looking at these systems and developing these procedures and all this, we're now looking at measuring and goal setting. All goals must be realistic. You know, as we define the systems, we kind of call it getting it into a controlled state. Is that as we start defining these systems and getting them to where they're within acceptable boundaries, upper and lower level. We're saying here is that now it's time to start, and we're able now to measure and goal set. What are the things that we want to improve, or where do we want to get to? And we're saying the goals have to be realistic. There's nothing, because I've been that guy down on the floor that someone comes in there and they come with an unrealistic goal or demand, and everybody in the place is going, oh man, that's a bunch of bull. I don't know where that guy's pulling that out of. But what we're saying here is that all goals must be realistic, because every time you come in with some unrealistic goal, your employees lose that much more faith and trust in the organization. So here again, we're saying, let's not insult our people. If we need 3%, tell them 3%. Don't tell them 19% and hope they'll do 3%, because that's what we have going throughout the organization. So let's be realistic. And again, just by dealing with the expenses or line item issues might do it short term, but again, we have to define and build those good process steps and procedures. Okay, a note, to start the process, we use a measurement and specification of what is acceptable and not acceptable. And we call that lower control limits and upper control limits. Really what we're looking at is kind of a process, the mean of it, and up top is what's the upper level, which is acceptable, and the lower level. So in that we have an upper and lower and the mean. Anything in between there is what we're calling is acceptable. So one of the interesting things we talk about is that, okay, what do we measure? Okay, if you look at it, we already have existing data and all kinds of stuff internally within the organization. So if you look on page 4, it kind of talks about some things. We can look at production run, raw material production, labor expense, defects by unit per shift, breakdown, trucking. We can look at pickup, delivery, breakage, spillage, backtracking, expenses, absenteeism and tardiness, daily, excused, unexcused. And this is really one of the black and white areas up front that we can really control, manage, plan, schedule, and monitor, because this is usually where the 1 to the 5 to 20% are abusing the organization because they have a tough time getting themselves out of bed and being at work. Office workers, they can look at and set goals, and they can measure paperwork handled, time scheduled, deadlines, accounts payable, receivable, 30, 60, 90-day terms, order, request process, customer issues. And let's look at the garage, because a lot of our organizations have garages where they do their own maintenance and preventive maintenance. Parts delayed, out of stock, hours billed, outside vendors, repaired, meaning that we're sending them outside, we can't handle it internally. Inventory, outdated, balanced, jobs not completed, maintenance, late, incoming paper. Maintenance, breakdowns, out of parts, inventories, jobs, hours logged, complete, incompleted paperwork. We got service, invalid sales orders, unauthorized changes, rework, bad service, out of spec, customer not happy with our product or service. Okay, and then we're saying here, add your own list. Go back through and look at the things that you were doing, and all we got to do is put them down. You probably have history. If you don't have history, you just start collecting the data and the history by what you want to collect. And then it says management. Employees, present, absent, or late. Order requests processed, projected, and actual. Work orders pending in process. Budget items of reporting-based work centers in my departments and our division. So management, remember, we're saying management is really managing, planning, scheduling, and monitoring the order request internally throughout the organization by the reporting-based work centers. Okay, let's go now to page 5, which is the control chart. The definition of a control chart is plotting or charting the potential results of what is measured. Really, a control chart is really no more than just a bar graph or something that we're writing up. We're plotting on a chart, and then that's basically it. And you can make it however you want, and you probably already have a gazillion examples of that. So we're looking at really a control chart is to just display that data that we're collecting. Okay, an example of a control chart, startup, charting and measuring what you're doing. Again, it's by base work center, department, division, product, service, absenteeism and tardiness. daily, excused, unexcused, tardy, redos, waste, scrap, production, service, delivery, pickup, paperwork, cost of downtime, and the list goes on. So if you look at this, what are those things that are issues internally within the organization? But again, the majority of the reason that there are issues there are because we haven't defined our process, steps, and procedures and gotten everybody involved in the organization. So again, that's why we talked earlier. Why get out and start doing all this stuff until you define your systems? Again, how do we define the systems? Break it down by processes, connect them together, create the systems, and in turn, our base work centers are the ones defining those process, steps, and procedures. That's why we need the base skills. When we're saying a stake in the ground, when a process is under statistical control, its performance is more predictable. This is what we talked a few paragraphs ago, is that when we have an informal system, it's a hit and a miss, and this thing's going all over the world, because the fact is that we don't have a system in place and it's not in a controlled state. So as we go in there and we start laying down the system by processes, basically coming to an agreement on it, is that what it's going to do is that it is going to hit between certain boundaries, and that was at upper and lower level. And then we can step back and look at it when it's in that controlled state. Now, there are some special causes or issues that go out, and we'll have to look at those, but we can probably throw them out. But then we're able to look at it's in a controlled state, so we're probably able now to measure. Okay, now this could really happen as we're starting to lay down those process steps and procedures that we're bringing it in to a controlled state. So now we're ready to not only keep defining the system, but look at the problems and the issues with the system. That's why, again, we have to have these base skills, because these people are going to have to be able to go in there and work in their base work centers and basically define their processes and also measure and monitor those processes and continuously improve them. So we're saying let's drive a stake in the ground, because we have to do this for continuance and growth. If you look at, let's go to page number 6. Page number 6 is a story in there about systems. And the systems, I'll read our life lesson. The system is, no system is too complex when people doing the actual job take it apart process by process, step by step, procedure by procedure. We're saying here that a system is the way that we do, again, everything internally within the organization. And we're saying here the systems have to be formal, meaning the systems have to be in written form. Because again, how in the world can we go in and looking at a system or a process if it's not defined, especially by the people doing the job, how in the world are you going to improve it? So if you, again, you look at the whole organization, and we're going to go over it again, and if you're looking at it, we're saying that the whole organization is made up of systems. Out of that, how do we get our handle on those systems internally within the organization? They look complex. When you start pulling them apart by process, they're not that complicated. And that's where the base work center comes in. So we got the systems, we start pulling them apart by base work center, we start focusing on them, and they define their process, step, and procedure. And then we link them together by internal supplier, we're doing our thing, and then we're giving it here to our internal customer. Linking them together create the systems. And again, one of the other things we're going to be focusing on in here, and as an organization, we really need to look at that order request system, because that thing touches everybody internally within the organization. Remember, we're directly or indirectly supporting or processing some part of that order request. And that the best way to do is start with that is with our sales form or order form or whatever you call, or purchase order, whatever, it doesn't matter. So that's what we're looking at in regards to systems and what we're focusing here on basically class number 9. Let's look at improving the process cuts expenses. Line item management hardly ever provides long-term solutions for the improvement of the way we are doing business. Now what we're saying there is that we're not saying that we can't go in and cut expenses, but what we're not saying is is, well, what we are saying is that sometimes, example, some of our earlier companies were having some cash flow issues, and there were some drastic things that we had to do by cutting some expenses to stay in business. But if we're looking at moving money to the bottom line by just cutting expenses, that's short-lived. It might last through you, but by the time you get your second or third generation management in there, or employees or investors or stockholders or companies, whatever you want to call it, is that it's short-lived, and all of a sudden we're going to have to go back in there and start beefing up the organization on all these expenses that we've cut out of here. And we're saying, let's improve the process and define it. That'll move and cut our expense, but that's long-term. But watch out for the habit of that line item management. And remember, we're just cranking them out of school like that right now. So what we want to do is not just look at that issue or that cash flow or whatever as a line item expense, we just cut it and move on. Our first question should be, is why is that out of whack? But again, we can't even get in and start looking at it and improving it until we define it. Then again, by defining it, we start to improve the thing. So if we're going to look at long-term for continuance and growth, what we have to do is improve the process. And how are we going to improve the process? We got to do it by a base work center. How are we going to, the base skills? Well, now if we had the best looking written defined process in the world and there's fear, how good is that process? If we're not communicating, we haven't had training on it, if we have no written procedure. This is what, again, we're talking about. And what if we just have a bad person that I'm reporting to, the base values? Again, you're going to see how all these things are intertwined together to make a successful organization. Let's look at page number 8, and it's called the blame plane flight 13. Put a name on the blame, and it says, when resolving issues, don't spend energy in a negative fashion by trying to defend or justify blame for that particular problem. Spend that energy focusing on how to resolve it. And if you look at it, especially when there's fear in an organization, what we're doing is that we're going to make sure that we're not going to get blamed for it. So you throw that hot potato over here, or that plane starts to land, man, I'm going to do everything I can to load it up and get it off again, because I don't want it landing here on me and dumping all that misery. So when there's fear in an organization, I'm not going to be able to step up and say, this is the issue, this is what we got to do. I'm just going to let that thing just circle around till everybody gets tired of it, and then we'll end the meeting and we'll just go beat something else up. So if you look at this, we're saying let's focus in on the problem. How many meetings, and this first came to light to me when we're in a boardroom and we have about 13 people, and we're in there, and they're board members, and we're sitting here spending the first hour, what we thought was going to be an hour meeting, and I know none of y'all have ever been in this, ended up being a 3-hour meeting. All we did was just go around and defend and justify why I had nothing to do with it. And what happened was we literally spent 3 hours of all this negative energy whipping the tar out of everybody defending and justifying. And then what happened at the end of the meeting, we never once spent a breath on how to fix it. Instead of, everybody came out all tired, all jacked up, and just said, you know, I'm about fed up with this mess. So again, here we're saying, if you want to blame something, blame the 4 barriers to quality. But good night, stop beating the tar out of your people and your other departments. If you want to look at it, let's look at the 4 barriers to quality. Don't defend or try to justify, don't pin blame. Keep everybody focused on what the problem is. What is it we have to do? And immediately they jump on the blame plane, deboard that bad boy, and get them in there focusing on the issues. Okay, let's look now at page number 9. Page number 9 is taking off the gloves. This kind of comes out of some of those earlier meetings we had when I got started is that the taking off the gloves of quality and change are worn by the hands of integrity and trust. Again, we got into this room and we got into this meeting with, I don't know, it was a couple of the departments, and here we are, we're sitting here literally what we call jockeying for position. We're making sure that thing didn't land on us, that problem. We're making sure that we're not getting blamed. And every time somebody would say something, we'd position over here, or we'd position there. And all of a sudden, we're saying, I'm going, hey, guys, let's just take the gloves off. Let's throw them out, and let's just come into the ring, shake hands, and let's move on. That's what we had to do in the boys' club when we were boxing. After the thing, they said, take the gloves off. We'd have to get back into the ring and shake the guy's hand. Sometimes it didn't work out that nice, but that's what we had to do. So we're saying here in the boardroom and in these meetings, take the gloves off, come in, shake hands, and let's focus on the issue, not beat our people up. And this is where we were saying about the smile, is that a smile in the morning improves life every day. Now, you heard a lot about this interpersonal stuff in our last workshop, and what we're saying here is that it's totally up to us and our decision whether we're going to have a good day or a bad day. It's here, and you won't believe it or not, when you start smiling, believe it or not, you start lighting up, and believe it or not, you do start feeling better. So if you look at that smile, if nothing else, if you can't say hey in the morning or whatever, just say, hey, smile in the AM. And if they laugh, that's fine. We're at least getting something going. So remember, when we're in these situations and in these problems, don't beat each other up. Take these gloves off. Let's focus on the issue, and let's look at it, and let's move through, and by focusing on the issue and not the personalities or departments or feeling that we have to blame. But remember, the tough thing is that when there's fear in an organization, that's what makes it so tough with the 4 barriers, because the only way we're going to work through and let that fear go is that through the consistency that promotes truth, that promotes trust. Okay, now let's look at page number 10. Now this is a form that we're looking at that you can, it's called the System Development Form. As we're going through the organization and we're looking at some particular systems that we want to define internally within the organization, this is a good form to gather our thoughts on, to literally take to those meetings and sit down and start putting that system together. If you look at, sometimes we form a task team to look at a particular system. So you just put the task team, whether you have a task team number or whether you have a task team name. Let's say it's the order request system. Okay, if you look up top, it says the system. What we want you to do there is name that particular system that you're going to be reviewing and working on. We also want you to put the date. We want you to put the date that the form was started. And that's going to be from here on out now, because we're going to start getting into some things to start doing, is that every date on these forms are when this form was started. All right, let's look at it. It says the product service of the system. Now this sometimes is tough to think through. We're looking at here the product service of the system. What is it that system is providing? By just coming to an agreement on that is going to help you clear up what system that you're focusing on. And it sounds pretty easy, what product or service of the system. By sitting there, coming to an agreement in that meeting with those base work centers that are going to be touching that, it'll make us think through a little further on what is it that we're really trying to define and what that system is there to do. Okay, now let's look down, and you see there it says base work centers involved in a system. We talked about how do we do this with systems. What we do with the systems is that we break them down by process, and y'all have heard that a few hundred times. Oh, and by the way, I want to clear this up. We've been getting memos. A lot of people have been asking, or not memos, but emails. I'm not from France. The accent is really from Alabama, so y'all don't need to send any more emails. Let's look at the base work centers involved in this system. If you look at the system, we're saying here, name those base work centers or those processes that are going to be involved in that system. So what we want to do here is that we just want to list them. Now, if you don't know what those base work centers or those jobs are called, just list the folks' name that are going to be involved in touching that particular system, okay? Again, the base work centers are involved. What are base work centers? Base work centers are your area of expertise and control, your job, the focus of your job. So remember, the rule is that we want to get everybody that's involved in the system involved in the defining of the system. So this is where you start now, listing all the base work centers that are involved. Because what is that going to do? That's going to start setting up your task team or your project management team or whatever you want to call it. But before we can get in there and develop those systems, we have to look at who is going to be involved in that. Okay. The other thing is, let's look down below. It says forms, paperwork, data entry, list attached. More than likely there will be. We want to look here and say, okay, for this particular system that we're looking at and we're going to get in review, or we're going to start, or it's a new product or it's a new service system, what we want to do is that we want to say, okay, what are the forms, the paperwork, the data entry screens, the computers, whatever it is, what is that stuff that we're going to use for data entry and collection and management? So that's in itself could probably, if you look out to the right, will become a task team. So what happens is you've got 2 or 3 folks there that kind of have the majority of the processes or paperwork systems in place. We're going to go, okay, maybe those should be the paperwork task team, if nothing else, or for System 1, or System 1.1 task team. So if you're looking at this, we now want to start organizing those teams and the people that are responsible for that particular function. Now, I was kind of cheating, so nobody go to the next page. We're going to list those on some action item things on the next page, but y'all don't go there yet. So if you look at this, we're going to have the forms and paperwork. Why are the forms and paperwork important? Remember, the paperwork and the forms are going to suggest the systems. That's going to suggest all the support stuff as well as all the other base work centers that are going to be touching that thing. Okay, now we want to look at the internal supplier. The internal supplier, who is giving that work to this system? Okay, we're looking at where does that system start? What base work center is giving them that work? Then we also want to look at the internal customer. Okay, as we're looking at this thing, the internal customer in this system, as we go through, whether it's, like I said, new product or service or whatever, is that, okay, as we go through our process, who do we give this thing to internally? Now, we're going to start looking at here in a second in that base or in that system task team, but right now we want to look at the system as a whole, kind of what we think it is. Number one, who's going to give it that work in that base work center? More than likely it's going to be internal. And then we're also internal, we're going to look at who are we going to give that finished product or service to internally to pass it on. And that's also going to set up. So we also want to look at here, starting to define our process and steps and procedures. Now what I'm suggesting there, when we're doing all this stuff up top before we get to the process and steps part, what we want you to do is really do your best to just kind of think about, and I would suggest the folks that are sponsoring this task team to put this thought in before you get the people together to look at this. Because it's easier to tear something up than it is to create it. And then if you've got to kind of create it based off of some knowledge there, is that it's easier to get the team focused and going into the right direction. So the sponsor of the task team pretty much has a good idea of what that system is going to look like or what it's there to do. So what we're saying here is kind of say, okay, what is the product or service of that system? What are the base work centers involved? Because that's going to start setting up your task teams. Then we're going to say who is the internal supplier and customer. That will in fact start setting up the processes linked together to create the system. Then we're saying here, let's get a team now. And this might even be good too for the sponsor. I would suggest the sponsor of this system development to do as much of this as they can before they gather the base work centers. And it might take the time to gather the base work centers together until you do some of this preliminary process and steps. So if you look at this, we want to look at process, steps, and procedures. And we want to look at trying to flow chart that out. And we can look at, okay, let's assign out this process and step. In that, We want to assign out, said, okay, Group A, you go over there and you kind of start looking at flow charting that thing. Well, it says procedure over there. We can't really get in that thing and start writing procedure until we've at least lined out and agreed on that process and step. But we also might want to look at, are there existing procedures for the system? Just like what we're doing, are there existing paperwork? Or what procedures do we see that are needed? So if you look, we talk about process and step flow or worksheet, just the flow chart. We're really going through now and starting to document and put that process step and agreement of that by the people, those base work centers involved. Then now we'll start defining the procedure. So if you look at this system as we're breaking it out, now there could be several base work centers in this system by whatever particular process. So who is the best person to define that base work center or that process? The person doing the job. See, this is how this stuff keeps going. Now we want to look at, let's just say that we did the process, step, and procedure. So now we're ready to move on. One of the things that usually fail in these things are we go through and do all the work and then we don't do a good job on the training and implementation. So we also want to be able to train and make sure that we have a formal process to train and implement this system once we've agreed on it and defined a procedure. Because that's just as important as anything else that we're doing. Because how many of us have all of a sudden turned on TV, especially larger companies, and we find out what we're going to be doing the next day or what the new direction of the organization is. And one of the interesting ones that I have a lot of, because I've done quite a bit of work on, that big company, one of them is like the post office. They're going, good night. Sometimes we find out what we're going to be doing and offering by looking at the TV and the commercial. Now you think of those issues with the post office. They got like a gazillion million employees and things all over the country and all kinds of, in almost every community out there. Now you think you got a tough deal. Look at what those guys are trying to handle. So let's look at training and implementation. Then we're going, is there a procedure needed? I guarantee you there's probably going to be a procedure needed. If we're having to go in and look at defining the system, yes, there'll probably be written procedure. Action items, we'll look at that in a minute. So what we're saying here is that this form is a good form for us to start trying to formalize how we're going to go through and define some systems. And we can use this for new system, new product, new service, it doesn't matter, but this is a good form to get that started and going. All right, now let's look at page number 11. Okay, page number 11 is the action item. This is what I was telling you not to turn over there and look at it and cheat. This is the action item. So if you look at this form here, literally for each one of these items that we were doing on the other form, from the form's paperwork, the process and step, the form procedure, the writing procedure for the process and step, is that literally we can assign each one of those task teams through this action item quick action form. And the reason we do this is that where we can manage, plan, schedule, and monitor as we're working through the development of this system. How many of us get into that meeting and we're all sitting around and we all talk about every reason in the world or what's wrong with that particular system or what we need to do to fix it, never come out of it with any action? What we're saying here again is here's an action item. This is to formalize what we've talked about and what we're doing. Now in these original systems meetings, the best way to start them is to come in with somewhat of as much of this work as you can done. At least outlining who's involved in the whole bit and maybe some paperwork and all that. And then as you get in there, you're going to find folks that probably have more ownership in that particular system than anyone else. So we want to do as much of the work probably in smaller groups, because man, you start trying to get 4 to 7 to 10 people to agree on anything, they ain't going to agree on nothing. So what you want to do is get those people in their area of expertise and control focusing on their particular process. So that's what this action item, if you look up top, it says team number, task team ID, the leader of it, the date, the problem statement, and what we're saying there, the problem statement here could actually be the name of the system that we're looking on, or if there's like a task team ID number, we'd put that there, or starting a new system. Then we're saying a quick action. A quick action is something internally within the organization that's very obvious to the team, and this form kind of has a dual purpose. That's to get, like, example, that the truck's broke down, well, the air conditioner needs fixing. Well, we'll formalize that request with what we call a quick action. Same thing with all the accountabilities, but it's a way that we can go through and make it happen in a formal process. Remember that order request, that formal internal request? Then we're going to base work centers involved. Again, what we're doing here is looking at what are those base work centers involved in this particular action item. And it could be each one of these base work centers individually, depending on what the teams are taking. Then we're having them list the item numbers, you know, 1 through whatever, and what is that action, who's doing it, when's it accepted, the target date, and the date completed. And this is how we manage, plan, schedule, and monitor and hold accountable on what we agreed on. And yes, the 1 to 5 to 20%, they're going to be negative. They're going to tell you every reason what we're doing ain't working or the way to do it, but they'll never get involved. They'll never do anything other than start throwing wrenches in it. So what we're saying here is that we got to keep moving ahead. And that's why a lot of organizations never do keep moving ahead. They've got those folks derailing everything, anything positive what the company is trying to do. So we also want to put the actual outcome or solution. Okay, let's just say, by the way, this happens to be, we're going to use this as kind of an action item form for developing the process and step. The actual outcome or solution is define the process and step for the system. Let's say it's the order request system. The comments, we'd put whatever other comments we'd want in there. Then we say, are there any forms involved? Yes or no? Does this need to be a procedure in a base work center? What do you think? Chances are, yes. This will probably have to become a procedure in every base work center that it's involved in. Then it's just some sign-off stuff and posting. So that's what an action item is. An action item is really to formalize the way and what we've agreed on what we're going to do and assigning those accountabilities. For when we get together the next meeting, because how many of those meetings go, I thought you were going to do it. I thought you were going to do it. No, I thought you were going. What we're saying here is that we're agreeing on who's doing what, and we're going to hold each other accountable. Because remember, most of the stuff we've done, we've never been held accountable, or we never finished up on that particular issue. Okay, now let's look at page number 12. Page number 12 is define our system process. Y'all remember what we talked about a while back about the defining the system and the flow charting and process mapping? Well, again, we tried to do that, but we could never write all the stuff in the little squares. So that's why we developed this process and step form. And if you look out there to the right, that says, is there a procedure need or done? So let's look at this group. Okay, we put this, if nothing else, we're going to call it a system task team. And this systems task team has come in with some new system or a system they've identified as one they've got to improve. So first of all, we're going to get in there and we're going to look at all the things internally of all the folks and all the base work centers that are involved. We're going to get them organized, and everyone's going to come out of there with an action item. And let's say we're now the part of the team that's going to look at the process and step. So really all we're going to do, process and steps for what? We're just going to call it that order request system. Okay, who's the employee name, the procedure number, base work center number? Y'all be able to assign that, and we'll talk about that later. So if we want to look at, we'll just put step 1, I receive whatever from whoever. Is there a procedure needed or done? Yes or no? So if it needed, then we'll write one. So if you look at what we use this form here is to start laying out the process. Now, don't put any of this stuff in a written form or in type form, not unless you've got a computer and y'all are real good on the computer and typing this stuff on. Most of our companies, we have some issues with the computer, so we just end up just writing them out. So don't spend a lot of time formalizing this, because this will go through several generations before we get to what we're really looking for. So again, we just start logging this stuff down. Now this could be an initial run at it to start lining up stuff for really that systems task team. So we want that might help us identify the base work centers, might help us identify the paperwork. But let's say we've done all that, and now we've got a crew that's just focusing on the process and step. So right now, that's what they're doing. They're really flow charting out that process and the step of that particular system. Now, and that could be happening for each base work center, because that's going to become or make us have a written procedure. So let's look at page 13. Page 13 is a systems procedure form. Now, what we're talking about there, if you look at this system procedures form, is that, remember on page 12, we looked at process and step. We were lining it out, and then it says, was the procedure needed and done? We're going to say it needed a written procedure, so we checked it, and this is the form that we write it on. Okay, now why do we use this form to write it on? Because if you look at this, it's going to tell us up top, and it's going to formalize of the stuff that we need in order to manage that particular procedure throughout the organization and throughout the development of this system and the continuous improvement of it. If you look at this, it says procedure solution for what? So we're going to say the order request system. Again, the date, if there was a task team ID number, is it an amendment or an addendum? Base work center procedure number. We're going to say this here is procedure, let's say 1. Down below we say problem statement. Problem statement is, and we'll get into this in another class talking about brainstorming for problems, about writing problem statements. Right now, this is does not apply, so we're just going to write the name of the system under review. If nothing else, order request. Again, we're going to mark what base work centers are, basically what base work centers need to be involved in the decision of this procedure, so we'll just list them there. Again, that's how we make sure that we get everybody involved in the definition and defining those particular systems. So we're listing all the base work centers, because as we go back through this, as the organization grows and changes and the systems and the processes, what will happen here, this will also identify those base work center and those people that need to be involved with it down the road. Because believe it or not, down the road you're going to forget why in the world you even did this thing to begin with. So we're going to look at the procedure. So let's just say it's reference step. You see up there at the top, number 1. So we're going to say reference step 1, and that does apply. And then we're going to start with the procedure. So we name the procedure up there, and now we just start listing it and writing it in process and step kind of. Literally, what is that procedure to do that particular step? Now, what we're suggesting here is to keep the procedure, especially the paperwork procedure, separate. Because if you look at most of the time, if we have a big, long procedure defining that particular whatever it is we're working on, is that you'll see it continually changes, either by mainly forms or paperwork that's coming in. We end up having to rewrite the whole procedure. That's why here we're saying let's write it in process and step, put the procedure out to the side, and then if that particular procedure changes, like new software, or we have a new machine that we're bringing online, well, that will represent a new procedure to process, my part of it. So we're not having to change the whole process, step, procedure, systems, and everything. All we got to do is pull that form out and that procedure. It's going to tell us who's going to need to be involved in it, get it together a task team, go in there, redefine that process and step, and then insert it back. Now remember, where are we keeping all this stuff? We're keeping all this stuff in information centers as well as our own base work centers. Okay, again, let's look at this. We got the process, step, and procedure. This is the procedure form. We got a systems form that we start formalizing all this stuff that we're going to do, whatever that particular system or process or product or whatever it is you want to call it, that we're going to start reviewing. So that's kind of the process that we're going to go through. And if you look at now on page 14, okay, all right, now let's kind of back up again. Okay, what is it that we're doing here? we're talking about in this workshop is defining the organizational systems. Okay, again, we look at the system up here. We're breaking that system up by processes or by base work centers. So literally what we do is that we go to that form, the systems form, to start defining it, and in that we just start listing who's doing what. We start listing what is the purpose of that form. We start listing what product or service does it, basically is it providing. What are the base work centers involved? Why is it important to have those base work centers that are involved in it? Because they got to be the ones that are helping us define what we're doing. So again, look at it. We got to go in, lay out all our base work centers. We have to go in there and look at our paperwork, our internal supplier, internal customers, our process, our steps, our flow chart, basically flow charting that process, linked together to create the systems, and then the training and implementation. We're also now looking at the action items. The action items are, in order as we're going through as a task team to manage, plan, schedule, and monitor all these actions or action items that are going to be happening to help us define that particular process and step. So as we're working through this systems, defining this particular system, we're really organizing it first, is putting out all of the folks that are involved in it. And usually it's not a brand new system. It might be a new product, but it's going to be plugging into somewhat of a similar system of how we process that order request. So we're going to have some paperwork, might even have some procedures. So we're going to start kind of moving through and gathering everything that we have. And then again, those action items are just for us to organize and hold accountable and manage our progress through this particular systems improvement. Then we're looking at the process and step form. Again, what is that doing? We're literally just flow charting and writing down what we're doing in that particular system that we want to be involved in. So then we're going to go through, we're going to list it, then we're going to look at what procedures are needed. And if there are procedures needed, okay, then we're going to go to our systems procedure form. Why do we want to use this form? Because it has all the information that we need in order to manage, plan, schedule, and monitor things, plus to continuously improve it. Because again, it's going to list everybody that's involved in that particular procedure, okay, as the organization grows or the system or the procedure changes, we can go right back to it because it's in our base work center, and it's going to tell us who are those base work centers we need to pull together to change that system. Because remember, what we don't want to do is start changing or defining or implementing things without everybody involved, because that's where we get kicked in the head with it. Because I guarantee you, we all done enough of that, is that if we go through and put that system out there without people being involved in it, what's going to happen is that it's going to be short-circuited, and all of a sudden the employees are going to go, here we go again. We've started with something now that I had no input in. They're telling me what I got to do, and it's wrong. Who in the world's making those decisions? Okay, so now you think about it. Now you think about the 4 barriers. Let's turn to the frequently asked questions and our thoughts. Okay, here again, let's go over explain by defining you improve systems. Okay, again, what we're looking at is that by defining those systems is we improve them. How do we define those systems? By getting everybody that's involved in them together on the same team or on the same task team, working to define them, coming to a consensus agreement. That's how we improve it. So that's what we're talking about there. By defining, you improve. Now remember, how we get messed up is that we have a problem with a process or a system or whatever you want to call it, and we're out there and we make a knee-jerk reaction. And I know you've never been involved in these. It's a problem. We pull everybody in and just try to figure out what went wrong and what we need to do the next time, or to get it back out to the customer to make them happy, and we never define the system. We're saying, oh, okay, I won't do that again. You know where we find ourselves again in a few weeks, a few months, or whatever, is that we're back there again trying to put out that fire. So we're saying by defining, you improve the system. Because remember, the same thing has to stay in line, and that is that everybody that's involved in the system has to be involved in defining that system. So in those base work centers, by getting everybody to come together and agree on those process steps and procedures, we're going to improve it. If we never take it another step further, that's what's so key of laying down those base work centers. Because just by defining it, as crude as it is, you improve it. Now the other thing that as you get into these things, don't get too caught up with being and having a perfect system. We're saying it's really tough when you go into an informal organization and you haven't really have any formal systems, and then you're trying to go in and define everything in the organization. It's really tough to do that, because as you start looking at the system, you immediately start saying, well, we need to do this or we need to fix that. And then what happens, this is what we're saying, we haven't even defined it, now we're trying to improve it. And we're saying, let's just lay the system down first. Now, there's some little bitty things that we can twist and turn, but without going in some massive changes, because we're already in enough chaos and enough stress and enough change as it is. So we're saying, initially, let's just go in and put that system to bed and try to get it into a controlled state, whether we can or not. But by laying it down, now we can go back in there and look at it with somewhat of a format and structure. So is process, step, and procedure like mapping and or flow charting? Yeah, it is. Again, I told you we started with that stuff years ago, trying to write it up on flip charts and on the boards, and trying to write everything in those little squares. We just couldn't do it. So what we did was create the process and steps form, which is really just like flow charting. We start up there and list step 1, list what that step is, step 2 all the way down, then out to the side if it's a more complex, or like if there's a form or form procedure, is a procedure needed, we check it, yes. Then we define that procedure on that procedure form. Okay, so if you look at, is it like process mapping? Yes, it is. And then we're saying, is it like flow charting? Yes, it is. But this is kind of an easier way to do it by just having a piece of paper and we just write it down instead of, again, trying to put it in those boxes. So if you have existing training where y'all have done some kind of certification and you have those models that are there in regards to the flow chart, this will fit right into it. So just look at it as a process mapping or flow charting. What is the difference between a process and a system? Well, now that's an interesting question. I had to go in and write our own definitions because everybody I talked to had different opinions. And then one saying a system's like a process and a process is like a system. And we got some terms and definitions, and we'll have some in this workshop. Then what we're talking about there, we're saying a system is the way we do things internally within the organization. And we're saying a system, there's a bunch of systems, and the systems are the way we do everything in the organization. So what we're saying for our definition, to make sure everybody's clear, is that a system is here, and we're tearing the system apart, not only by base work centers, but we're tearing them apart by process. So we're saying processes linked together by internal supplier and customer create the systems. So that's what we're talking about, and that's where we're saying for each one of those processes, there's usually a base work center that's involved with that. And it says, why is an order request system so important? Boy, now that's that one there you could spend about 25 years on. If you look at this, it's why is it important? Well, the reason it's important, that's how the order request, or I'm going to just say a purchase order, whether it's internal or external, where it's coming, we're going to say a purchase order is the same as getting an order in. That's given us really our marching orders internally within the organization. That's why it's so important. And you know, when we get phone calls from out in the field, I ain't got time to fill out that work order. Here it is verbally over the phone. not giving us any information, so now it starts in the system and everybody's kind of interpreting what they think that customer or that salesman ordered. Seeing where that problem is that now we're assuming. So what happens is we end up doing the wrong thing wrong, the wrong thing. So here, the order request system, why it's so important, because that's how we all get paid and that's why we're all in business. So we have to formalize that. Remember, order is external, request is internal. Formalize that system, because that's going to set up the base work centers, and each one of our base work center of what we're processing to support that internally within the organization. So if you look at, we have to have a well-defined order request system. Then it says, how does paperwork help define the system? Again, we talked about, especially in some of this concept of the base work center, we couldn't really tell anybody what we did because we did a gazillion other things daily. And so we said, well, go out and gather up all your paperwork and data screen entries and all that other stuff. What we discovered then is that the paperwork started suggesting the systems that I were dealing with internally within the organization and in my base work center. So again, we looked at, okay, if we collect the paperwork, that is going to suggest the systems. So that's why we talk about that. Let's grab the paperwork, that's going to suggest how the system is probably going to go. That's why we talked about in this system review or startup is that gather all the paperwork involved, because that's really going to line up all those base work centers that are going to be touching that and the events and actions that are going to happen. Okay, is a base work center a system and or a process? Whew. Now that's a good question. If you look at, we're just going to say a base work center right now is a process, and that process is your job, your area of expertise and control. And we're saying by linking those processes, create the systems. So in effect, you're going, well, is it a process or a system? We could beat it any way known to man, but what we're saying right now, it's really, now my base work center could be a complete system, but without getting too far down the road, we're saying that the systems are broke up by processes that are usually there's a base work center that is controlling that process. You can't problem solve until you define the system. You know, this is what we talked about earlier. How in the world can you problem solve when you haven't defined what in the world you're working on? So again, we said where we started problem solving and going out and trying to fix things, we realized real quick as we got out there that trying to brainstorm when nothing's been defined, we started creating 10, 20, 30 other problems. And before you know it, everybody's just beating the tar out of everybody because everybody's so frustrated. So we're saying here, how in the world can you start problem solving until you define the system? But by defining the system, you start improving it. And in fact, are we not problem solving? That's the thing we're starting to look at with that system there. Yes, we are. But we have to take a systematic approach with it in a formal process. This is why all the base work centers have to have the base skills. Is number 7 from above problem solving? That's what we just talked about. Yeah, it is. So we're problem solving in our area of expertise and control. So if you look at kind of where we're at, we're looking at here, looking at systems. The next one we're going to be getting into, which is going to be fun, is the base work center startup. We'll start tying all this stuff together here. So look forward to seeing you at our next class. Thank you.